Amara was 13 at the time, but she had a mature mind. She understood her family's problems and agreed to go with Aunt Mabel. Lagos was quite different from where Amara had come from. It was big and filled with people who seemed to be always on the move. Onitsha was a busy place, but this place seemed a lot more busier. However, she would study hard in Aunt Mabel's house and make her family proud. Her mother had warned her about Lagos boys, so she would stay away from them. But Amara was soon going to find out that Lagos boys were going to be the least of her problems. Once upon a time, in a beautiful city situated in the eastern part of Nigeria, lived a man named Okonkwo. Okonkwo was wealthy and influential. He was a successful trader who sold electronics imported from overseas and sold in the popular Onitsha main market. People from far and wide patronized Okonkwo, and as soon as his business empire began to spread, one day, misfortune struck. Okonkwo had just imported a container load of electronics worth 400 million naira, some of which he had hoped to pay for when he finished selling the goods. His boys had finished offloading the container into the warehouse and locked up. Very early the next morning, Okonkwo received a phone call that would change his life forever. His warehouse had been engulfed in flames, and all his goods burned to ashes. Before the security men could notice what was going on, nearby stores had even been affected by the fire. Okonkwo nearly lost his mind when he got there. His life was over. All his money was gone, burned to ashes. And to crown it all, he still owed his suppliers a huge amount of money. Immediately, his blood pressure went up and he was rushed to the hospital. His wife was frustrated too, but then her husband was down and she had 5 children to care for, so she had to be strong for the family. In no time, debtors started calling. Mama Amara, as she was popularly called, had to do something. She sold off the rest of the goods in her husband's shop, but the money was barely enough. Her husband owed his suppliers over 200 million naira. She sold off their lands and their cars to be able to raise the rest of the money when the pressure became too much. Feeding had become a problem, and they could no longer afford to pay their children's school fees. If not for the fact that Okonkwo had built a very beautiful house already, they may not have had a roof over their heads. Okonkwo had become a poor man. He had moved from grace to grass. Those that he helped when the going was good, all turned their backs on him. Even his fellow electronic dealers were reluctant to help him. When Okonkwo got better and returned home, he realized that all the fortune he had spent years building had disappeared into thin air. However, He accepted his fate, believing that once there is life, then there is hope. Okonkwo and his wife could no longer afford to pay their children's school fees or even afford 3 square meals, so they had to send their children to public schools. Mama Amara had saved some money after she sold off their properties to pay their debt. With the money she had saved, Okonkwo and his wife set up a small shop where they sold cheap electrical appliances on the streets where they lived. But the proceeds were barely enough to put food on the table. Aunt Mabel, Mama Amara's sister, came all the way from Lagos to visit when she heard what had happened. Moved with pity, she offered to take Amara, the eldest child, to live with her in Lagos, promising to send her to a good school and take good care of her. Okonkwo and his wife were reluctant to let their child go at first, but they knew that if Aunt Mabel took Amara, it would relieve them of a little burden, so they let her take Amara. Amara cried so hard. She did not want to leave her family, but her mother called her and spoke to her at length. Amara was 13 at the time, but she had a mature mind. She understood her family's problems and agreed to go with Aunt Mabel. Lagos was quite different from where Amara had come from. It was big and filled with people who seemed to be always on the move. Onitsha was a busy place, but this place seemed a lot more busier. However, she would study hard in Aunt Mabel's house and make her family proud. Her mother had warned her about Lagos boys, so she would stay away from them. But Amara was soon going to find out that Lagos boys were going to be the least of her problems. Aunt Mabel's house was big and very beautiful, not too different from the type of house her father had built in Onitsha, but it had a lot of rooms, which showed that Aunt Mabel was doing well for herself. She had no husband and children, but her house was filled with girls around Amara's age. The girls moved around quietly and had this sense of despair permeating from their demeanor. When Amara got to Aunt Mabel's house, some of the girls rushed out to collect their bags, and Amara's box was taken to a small room with no bed. She was to share the room with 4 other girls. Amara was surprised. She did not expect to meet this number of girls in Aunt Mabel's house, talk more of having to sleep with 4 strange girls on the bare floor. She started crying. At least, back home, she had a bed to sleep on in her own personal room. The girls looked at her with pity, but they could not help her. They also needed help. That night, Amara had to spread her clothes on the floor to be able to get some sleep. The next morning, Aunt Mabel called her to her room and told her that since she would be feeding her and catering for her needs, it was only fair enough that she earned a little money for her in return. Therefore, she would immediately start following the other girls to sell in the market. Amara asked Aunt Mabel about the school she promised to send her to, and Aunt Mabel told her that she would resume school the following term, since the term was already halfway gone. Amara believed her. Aunt Mabel had a total of 14 girls at that time working for her, and the eldest of them was a 16-year-old girl from the north named Amina. Aunt Mabel had asked Amina to go with Amara that day and make sure that she learned how the business was done. Aunt Mabel had a small factory that produced zobo and kunu. So every day she would distribute the girls into different big markets located in different parts of Lagos to sell the drinks. At the end of the day, the girls would give account of what they sold and deliver the money to Aunt Mabel. Amara set off with Amina to Alaba International Market. She was not going to sell anything that day. All she had to do was follow Amina and learn how to sell. She was a smart girl, and before the end of the day, she had learned the ropes. On their way home, she asked Amina questions about how she and the other girls came to live with Aunt Mabel. It was then that Amina told her how Aunt Mabel saw her selling oranges on the roadside. She said, "She came to me, bought oranges, and asked me why I was not in school. I told her that my parents could not afford to send me to school. She asked if I wanted to go. Then I said yes. I was 10 years old at that time. I saw my mates going to school, and I also wanted to go too. Madame followed me home that day and talked to my parents. She promised them that she was going to train me in school till I finished university. My parents were skeptical because they did not know her. But Madame convinced them that she was on a mission to help young girls to achieve their dreams. My parents needed help, so they agreed. That was how I came to Madame's house. I have not gone to any school since. This is the same method she used to get the other girls too. We talk to our parents once in a month under her watchful eyes. We dare not say anything. My parents believe I am going to school," Amina said, with tears in her eyes when she finished her story. Fear gripped Amara. She felt a deep sense of sadness wash through her. She just wished she could open her eyes and this would all be a dream. She could not sleep that night. All she could do was cry. She felt pain, mostly because Aunt Mabel was her mother's blood sister, and she could not understand how one could do this to her own blood, or even anyone. She concluded that Aunt Mabel was evil and bitter. And in her despair, she decided that she would save up some money and run back to her father's house. Holding that thought, she fell asleep. The next morning, Aunt Mabel gave Amara her own portion of drinks to sell, but she still had to follow Amina as she was not yet familiar with the market and its environs. One of the valuable lessons she learned from Amina is that you had to smile for people to buy from you. With that, Amara sold her drinks in no time. But it was the first day of many more days to come. Amara had not experienced this kind of hardship before. This whole experience was new to her. She wept in her heart and silently prayed that God would make a way for her to escape this kind of hardship. Even saving money as she had planned was nearly impossible because Aunt Mabel knew exactly how much worth of drinks each girl went out with. And if it was discovered that money submitted after the day's sales was not complete, the culprit was made to go without food for the whole day. This continued for a long time. The new term had resumed, yet there was still no talk about her going back to school. One day, she summoned the courage to confront her aunt about her promise to send her to school. Aunt Mabel was furious and flogged her mercilessly for having the guts to ask her questions. That day, Amara realized that she was nothing different from the other girls in her aunt's eyes. To worsen it all, Aunt Mabel would forcefully make her write a letter to her parents, telling them how happy she was in her house and how much she loved her new school. After writing the letter, Aunt Mabel would add some money to the letter and send it to Amara's parents. Her parents had no clue as to what she was going through. As the days went by, Aunt Mabel brought in new girls to join them, thereby expanding her business. Amara could only wish that she had refused to go with her aunt and just attended a public school in Onitsha. She was a very intelligent girl, and it pained her that she may never be able to achieve her dreams, except things turned around, and she could not see the possibility of a turnaround in view. One whole year had passed, and instead of things to get better, it only got worse. One fateful day, Amara had gone to hawk as usual. After the day's sales, she boarded a bus that would take her home. A few minutes after the bus left, she started feeling sleepy. She looked around her and saw that some of the passengers were already asleep. She tried all that she could to fight the sleep, but she could not. Plus, she was very tired. When Amara opened her eyes, she was in a dark room. She tried to remember what happened, and the memory all came rushing back. She looked at the room. It was pitch black, but she could make out some voices of people who seemed to be crying. She had seen movies where things like this happened, but she never knew that she would one day become a victim. She cried bitterly, but she knew crying would not solve anything. Just then, the door opened, and a tall, dark-skinned man entered. It was dark, so she could not clearly see his face. She could not know exactly what he looked like. The torchlight in his hands came on, sending a sudden flash of light across the room. From where she sat, she quickly shut her eyes, pretending to be asleep. But she could see that she was kept in the room with a woman who was crying bitterly, begging the man to let her go. The man hit her hard across the face and tried to drag her out, but she fought him with all her strength. He made a sound, and another equally tall man came into the room. The two men dragged the struggling woman outside together. Maybe it was sheer luck or fate. I'm not sure. But when the men carried their other captive, they left the door open, all their attention focused on the woman. Immediately Amara saw the open door, she did not think. She got up and ran out of the room. She discovered on running out that she was in a thick forest. At first, she was afraid, but there was no time to think. The men would be back any moment, so she ran and did not look back. After a while, she got tired, but she knew that resting was going to be a deadly plan. The day got brighter with each second that passed, so she knew it was the break of dawn. She kept running till her legs could carry her no more. Then it occurred to her that if she could climb a tree, then the bush of the tree would provide a covering for her while she rested. She looked around her and saw a big mango tree. It was just perfect. Soon after she had climbed the tree, she heard the man's voice approach her direction. They moved very fast, obviously searching for her. She sat glued to the tree, praying in her heart that the men would not find her. The men got to the tree where she was perched and passed, cursing and angrily listing all the vile things they would do to her when they found her. Her heart was pounding so hard in her chest. She breathed a sigh of relief when they passed where she was hiding. But when they passed, she remained there until they came back, what seemed like an hour later. The men did not find her. They went back the way they came, for they had other people locked in different rooms to attend to. The kidnappers consisted of two men who, under the guise of driving a bus, took their innocent victims from the roadside and brought them to their hideout inside the bush, where they killed them and harvested their vital organs, and then buried their remains in a shallow grave. The harvested organs were sold to those who needed it for one thing or the other at a very high price. Amara waited for a while after the men had gone. Then she came down from the tree. It was already bright, so she could see her surrounding clearly now. The whole place was covered by tall trees and green shrubs. With renewed energy, she continued running. She ran and ran until she became exhausted, for she had not eaten anything since she left her aunt's house the day before. So, she was already very weak and hungry. Just as she sat down to rest, she started hearing the sound of cars passing. Then she knew that she was very close to the busy road. So, with renewed energy, she got up and started walking. She walked for what felt like eternity until she came out of the bush and found herself on the busy express road. When she came out, she did not stop walking. She kept moving until she got to a place that looked like a market. There were lots of people moving around, buying and selling. At that point, she started to feel lightheaded. Her legs went limp and she collapsed, everywhere going black. While all this was going on that night, Mama Amara could not sleep. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw Amara crying in her dreams. She knew that something was not right, so she went down on her knees and started praying. She prayed all night for the safety of her daughter until daybreak. When Okonkwo woke up, his wife told him about the strong feeling she had that things were not okay with their daughter. Okonkwo suggested that they called Aunt Mabel and insisted that they wanted to speak to her. That was exactly what they did. Aunt Mabel started panicking immediately she saw their call. She already knew that there was a problem. Okonkwo and his wife would not keep quiet when they found out that their child was missing. And it was still past 6 a.m., so she could not use being in school as an excuse. Therefore, she did not pick their calls. Also, she could not go to the police because they would ask a lot of questions and she would be in more trouble. A deafening silence descended upon Aunt Mabel's household that day. The girls did not go out to sell. They also knew that there was trouble. And while they were happy that their madam was in trouble, they also prayed for the safety of Amara. When Amara regained consciousness, she saw herself lying in an hospital bed. She looked around her and saw this middle-aged lady sitting beside her. Immediately the lady saw that she was awake. She ran to get the doctor. The doctor came in and checked her, after which he declared that she was okay. He asked a few questions, but Amara was not responding. She just kept staring at the both of them. The woman became worried, But the doctor told her that the young girl may be in shock as a result of what she may have gone through. He suggested that they gave her a little more time to rest before they could actually find out what happened. The woman looked very worried, so the doctor gave her a hug to calm her down, assuring her that all was going to be well. Okonkwo and his wife still had no luck reaching Aunt Mabel. Then they were already convinced that something was wrong, and Okonkwo started making plans to go to Lagos. But the problem was that they did not know where Aunt Mabel lived. They had allowed her to take their daughter because she was family and not some random stranger. They were restless. They prayed incessantly for the safety of their daughter, since that was all they could do at the moment, while they made findings to know where Aunt Mabel lived. 2 days later, Amara had finally talked. She asked the good woman who never left her side for a cup of water. The woman, whose name was Rose, was excited to hear her talk. She had been by her side since she had found her lying unconscious in the market 2 days ago. People surrounded her frail form, but nobody was willing to touch her or do anything to help the poor girl. As a doctor, she knew that leaving that girl there for a longer time could be very dangerous. So she picked her up, put her in her car, and brought her to the hospital she co-owned with her husband. She knew that something very bad had happened to this girl, but she could not help her until she heard the full story. She was happy that finally the long wait was over. She gave her a cup of water and then called the doctor, who also happened to be her husband. Amara was glad that she was fine after all. These people had been nice to her, so she knew that the least that she could do was to tell them what happened to her. Then, just maybe, they could help her bring Aunt Mabel down and free all those girls that Aunt Mabel had deceitfully taken from their parents. She told them her name and everything that had happened to her, from how Aunt Mabel had taken her and the other girls from their parents under the guise of training them in school, to how she was kidnapped and then how she managed to escape. Dr. Rose was moved to tears after she heard Amara's story. She and her husband promised to help her and the girls bring down Aunt Mabel for good. With their connections, Dr. Rose and her husband reached out to the Child Welfare Center. Their response was prompt, and Amara was encouraged to make a statement and gave Aunt Mabel's address. In no time, the police and the child welfare officers stormed Aunt Mabel's house, and she was arrested. They found a total of 22 young girls from the ages of 10 to 17 years old. The evidence against Aunt Mabel was too concrete. There was no way out. She was tried and sentenced to 40 years in prison for child theft and child labor. The girl's parents were contacted through Aunt Mabel's phone. It was a reunion that brought tears to the eyes that watched. Some parents had not seen their children in the past 6 to 7 years and could not even tell their whereabouts. It was a lesson to all present to never give away their children to anyone for any reason. If it was difficult to pay the child's school fees, they could learn a trade and still be useful to themselves, their parents, and the society at large. The police, with the help of Amara, were able to locate the kidnappers then. But the men were smart. They knew that the girl who escaped was likely to come back with the police, so they cleared out the whole place and disappeared. Amara was disappointed, but the police assured them that they would keep looking for the kidnappers until they found them and made them pay for their crimes. Dr. Rose and her husband personally took Amara home to her parents. Okonkwo and his wife cried when they heard all that their child had gone through. They were more heartbroken because it was their own that had hurt them so deeply. They thanked the kind couple for saving their daughter's life and helping to bring down the wicked Mabel. Dr. Rose and her husband had been married for 8 years and had no children of their own. Therefore, they offered to pay Amara's school fees up to university level. Okonkwo and his wife were very happy and thanked the couple for their act of love and kindness. Amara was enrolled into the boarding facility of the Federal Government Girls' College in Onitsha. During the long holidays, she would go to Lagos to spend some time with Dr. Rose and her husband. Amara was happy that things had turned around for her. She would study hard and become a good doctor, just like Dr. Rose, and make her parents proud. If you enjoyed this video, please give this video a thumbs up, drop a comment, and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.